My name is Doug Strong, and I'm going to talk to you today about the 14th century armor, and specifically the glancing surface and the impact that it had on 14th century armor. To give you a little bit of information about myself, I've been making armor since 1983, so this is 20 years, although I had a period in the middle where I didn't do much. I got a little tired of armor, but I'm really happy to be back making armor. I've been studying armor actively all that time. I've been researching 14th century armor now in an active way since 1987, when I began the first draft of the book that I've been writing, that in theory will come out next summer, though. Let's see. In the process of doing that, I learned a lot of stuff. One thing I learned is most people haven't seen most of the 14th century armor that's out there. And also, there are some features that are common to 14th century armor that most people may not have thought about. And so what this paper is designed to do is to go through some of the features that you see in 14th century armor and talk about how and why they came to be. And it's based on a human psychological construct that says all behavior has purpose. And if you look at that and apply it to armor, all form has a function. Some of that function is art. Some Gothic armor is mirroring architectural details and illuminated manuscript details that you might find in contemporary art. But it also has a purely pragmatic function. And so what I'm going to do is try to talk to you a little bit about that relationship between the glancing surface, which is a relatively new concept in the 14th century, and how it drove the shapes and the forms and some of the additions that you'll find in the 14th century armor. So, with little ado, let's get started. For hundreds of years, knights went into battle protected almost exclusively by mail. However, in the 14th century, plate armor began to supplant mail as the primary form of armor worn by knights. We have a Beauchamp effigy, typical of a knight in armor at the end of the 14th century. Plate armor was superior to mail armor for two primary reasons. The first way in which it was superior was that, like mail, it was effective against sharp edges of weapons. But it had the additional advantage of being able to resist the crushing, damage, and blunt trauma which mail was unable to defend against, except through its padding. The second way in which mail was superior, and plate armor was superior to mail, is when carefully made and employing smooth surfaces, it caused weapons to skid without injuring the wearer. Mail, because of its rough texture, does exactly the opposite and helps weapons to find purchase. This is especially true of sharp-pointed weapons, such as arrows, lances, and thrusted weapons like a sword. It has long been known that the discovery and the popularization of glancing surfaces revolutionized the world of armor. By making armor, plate armor that is, so that weapons would skid harmlessly off the plate, armorers could create pieces that were lighter, more streamlined, and altogether safer. However, the popularization of the glancing surface resulted in many defenses that were certainly the product of some painful experience. It must have been discovered soon after the glancing surface came into vogue that a skidding weapon was not always a harmless weapon. No doubt these weapons slid into openings in the armor, especially into body joints, elbows, underarms, crotch. Just a bad idea. And thus into unguarded, or at least more lightly guarded, parts of the wearer's body. It is evident by the wide variety of turned edges, stopped ribs, and liseré doré designed to help the weapon deflect elsewhere where it would not injure the wearer of the armor. If we examine the armor of the 14th century, when the glancing surface was relatively new, we can see that many inventions were created that served to turn skidding weapons from vulnerable regions in the body. These were affixed to nearly every part of the suit of armor. We can see them on great helms, bassinet skulls, bassinet visors, breastplates, arm harnesses, leg harnesses. Essentially, every piece of armor that employs the glancing surface. The only pieces of plate armor that do not have any specifically designed stop ribs or deflection devices were gauntlets, greaves, and sabatons. Now they may have, but none of the surviving examples, all one surviving sabaton, and the dozen or so surviving gauntlets, and all 3 surviving greaves, don't have that. It's a pretty limited pool of information to draw from. All right. Head defenses were the first form of plate defense to be employed in the Middle Ages. Even when knights were encased from head to toe in mail, as they were in this picture, head defenses were usually rigid helmets, in addition to and supplementing mail. About the earliest form of complete head defense was the barrel helm. The earliest forms of these were quite straight-sided with flat tops. An example of this sort of helm dating to the turn of the 14th century was found at Schlossberg in Dargen. This is a pretty commonly known great helm. You can see, though, that it takes into account some of the facts that we talked about. This helm was the earliest example of anything that may serve to deflect glancing blows. The central ridge of the ocularia is fitted with a cruciform reinforce. While this piece was probably designed to strengthen the pieces, as they are lacking vertical overlaps in the front plates. I need to explain that. Typically on a great helm, these plates overlap and are structurally joined together. These do not. They butt up against each other. This is a really weak joint. This plate serves 2 functions. One is to reinforce the pieces because they have no lateral stability. And 2, it could be used to stop a skidding weapon from glancing into the ocularity. By the middle of the 14th century, this had evolved into a great helm with a rounded deck plate and sloping sides. This is among the first pieces of armor to evolve in form to take advantage of glancing surfaces, from the flat, straight-sided to a very conical type of helmet. On late 14th century great helms, we find that the edges of the eye slots, as you can see in the lower portion of the illustration, are turned at a 90-degree angle to the surface of the helm. Several of the most famous surviving great helms have their eye slots made in this way. The great helm and the Royal Armouries being a particularly fine example of this. And you can see how strongly they're turned outward. Now, this is a detail that a lot of people miss when looking at the helmet because it looks like many others. It's a very simple helmet, and people don't take the time to look at it. They do some mental shorthand, and they say, this is a great helm, therefore it's pretty straight.
What's the purpose of turning those out? Is that stiffen it?
Now, to keep a glancing weapon from going into it. It does add the fact that it stiffens the edges. But I think the primary function is to keep it from stopping a weapon from going in. By the way, please feel free to stop me at any point. This is a conversation, although I'm reading the paper.
Since the flaring out would also deflect the point away from that ultra vulnerable eye slot as well.
Yeah, and I think that's the primary function of it. The glancing surface keeps weapons moving along these planes. But a weapon moving along this plane, especially a skidding corner, can easily enter the eye slot. That's the primary function, at least according to my thesis, of these ocular flanges. The other popular head defense in the 14th century was the bassinet. The bassinet was designed to maximize the effects of the glancing surface. When fully developed, as in this example, virtually every surface on the bassinet would have encouraged glancing. The conical snout of the so-called pig face visor is a particularly effective glancing surface. Because of its design, skidding weapons would have been likely to have been heading from the face towards the back of the helmet, skidding off. Particularly helpful when you're dealing with a jousting situation with a lance or a hail of arrows, things coming at you. It makes it want to go back.
I never really saw it before, but with the previous picture, this almost looks like a logical progression in the technology of the turned out surface right at the ocular.
Exactly. So, and that brings me to the next point. Right? This allows the weapon, while skidding along this conical snout, to go right into the eye slot. Of the examples that survive, they all have this flanged eye slot. It's one of the most noticeable features common to every single one of the 80 surviving bassinet visors is the flanges around the eye slots. These flanges occur on both round and pig-face styles of visors. The reason for this is that it keeps a skidding weapon from entering the eyes. Mere boxing out of the eye slots may not have been enough to satisfy every armorer, though. In some cases, in the last quarter of the 14th century, we begin to see some of these ocularia being boxed out in the form of a grill. This example in Vienna in the Kunsthistorisches Museum has probably had the entire eye opening made in the form of a grill. There's evidence, if you examine the helmet in person up close, that the central, larger rectangular opening is the result of a later modification. Could have been done for added visibility, or more likely as the result of cleaning up some damage. The grills next to it are also cracked. It's likely they were cleaning up some. You have a question? Go ahead.
In the previous slide, one on the left, it looks like there's actually two. The ocularia are there's two sets of your flanges. There's a
This one here?
On that one. There's a larger one. Am I right? There's a second.
In this case,
In
it's
there.
one rectangular opening. The
Oh,
lower
okay.
edge is
They're
serrated.
inside lines.
And then
Okay,
these
so
here,
So it's not two different angles.
no,
Okay.
it is
Yeah,
a
that's-
fairly straight conical form. You know, it's a shape, section of a cone or a section of a wedge. And then these are engraved lines. But that's one of the detail features that you find on almost every high-quality bassinet is some form of engraved lines around the eye slots. You'll find it here too. It has file marked lines. Typically, these lines outline the bassinet visors. You can find it down here. You can find it here around the mouth. It's just one of those details. That's not a functional. That's an artistic or cleanliness kind of thing. It adds some definition. Yeah.
The eyepieces, are they just raised up or are they a separate piece?
No, they're pushed out of the metal or raised out of the metal. Yeah, actually, pass that one around. They're not a separate piece. I do know armorers who fabricate that, but there's no reason that you need to do that. You can push it straight out of the metal.
How long did it take you to make
All right, don't worry about it.
Yeah.
Do you want to
6 months.
When we talk about this one, I'm probably going to come back to this slide in a little bit. All right, so then we're looking at cleaning up that next. Some of these visors will be made in the form of boxed out grills with only holes in the flattened portions of the ocularia. Now when we talk construction here, very clearly, this whole section is raised out as a closed piece. And these are pierced later. The same is likely to be the case in some of the other ones. Do you still, Aaron, do you still grind them off if you're done? Box the whole thing out?
I get it to a certain point, I start putting holes in it, clear it all the way out. I'm pleased.
Yeah, I start with a tiny row of 1/8-inch holes in the middle of mine, push it out because it makes the metal move faster. But other than that,
He's been boxing them all the way out, and
Then-
grinding them out.
Right.
And that seems to be really consistent.
Right.
The majority of
so when you look at this one, and by the way, we also come back to those engraved decorations, the firework is there. You see that on all these. Bassinet visors were sometimes made with mouth openings as well. Sometimes, not always. You look at the bottom, there's a mouth opening. This is made in the same style as the eyes. And often if you look at visors, they'll have a matching system in place. The ocularia and the mouth opening are very similar, but not always.
I've seen other pictures of the thing is that face visor. It's not completely uniform either. It shows that even the masters of that era couldn't get it always perfect every time.
I think I did interpret that differently. I think everything's deliberate. And I think it's form that was designed. I think they wanted that shape. But plenty of examples of bad armoring that survive. There's a lovely example of a bassinet in the Swiss National Museum. And the bassinet visor is here, and the bassinet is sort of at a 10 or 15 degree angle off of the thing. So the visor's kind of set like that. And it's totally real, it's uniform, it's original, and it's just very badly made. So there's a lot of schlocky armor that survives. But in this case, I think that's a pretty good one.
Back onto the question of mouth openings on bassinets. Do they purposely make them look like they're smiling?
It's a hard question because they don't all look that way. Some of them do look like they're smiling, and it gives that sort of evil grin you get from that, which is, a certain amount of intimidation factor. But some of them, though, are straight across. Yeah.
Would you think that part of the mouth might be glancing down into the gorget?
It would serve that function, though the mouth openings are not all as pronounced as that. So that would
I was
certainly
kind
be
of looking here, maybe see like this part.
And we have the same thing if we go back to this example. It has a knob on the end, which would serve to catch things, but not all of it. And this one's a definite smiler. These openings were treated in the same manner as the ocularia. They were most commonly flanged, but occasionally the flanges were treated in different ways. Some examples have the mouth region flanged out, but there's no opening. There's no actual cutout in here. There's only holes pierced. So they've taken the time to do it without opening it up. Some of the mouth openings were done like boxed out grills. Here you have an example of two different styles on the same visor. So they don't always match. This one, when you look at it very closely, it's very clearly boxed out and filed, and there's still some ragged edges around it where the filing didn't get done thoroughly. Somebody could have gone in with a very nice needle file and cleaned it up, but they didn't. And on some, the mouth openings are omitted altogether. So once again, you can see the lovely filed and incised lines.
See, with that piece, it's like, there's not a smooth transition like underneath the pig nose. It actually stops or comes to a right.
You could be wrong. That could be part of the function of it. Certainly, it would be, whether it's intentional or not, if you follow the theory that all form has function, it would do that. Therefore, it would be a little more popular than one that wouldn't do that. Another feature we find on bassinets are triangular lugs on the sides of the bassinets. On this bassinet, and two other surviving ones in the Poldi Pizzoli in Italy, in Milan, there are these triangular lugs. They go from nothing up to a wedge shape. Their purpose is to take a skidding weapon and have it hop over the leather band that holds the ab and tail on. If it's there, it can cut it, and in theory, render the male not as securely attached and therefore more vulnerable.
It's kind of stupid, but is this something that like bassinets and stuff would be your average infantry soldier would wear, or is it something like somebody with greater range?
Both.
What's the question?
Is the question, what's the rank of somebody who would wear a bassinet? Bassinet is the most common helmet of the 14th century. Most of the examples we're seeing here are what you might call knightly bassinets. They're higher end. Bassinets without visors are more of a foot soldier's helmet. But there's examples of foot soldiers in illuminations wearing pig-faced bassinets, round face, and the whole deal. Yeah, that's one of the ones in the Poldi Pizzoli.
This one is more.
I'm trying to find it right now.
Yeah, it's on number 22 and 23.
And these also show up on the
Absolutely. You see, it happens to be on three surviving activities, but they do show up all over effigies. The Freiburg example, Freiburg effigy.
A later question would be then, why do these disappear? I mean, the bassinets that we show up on
Mid-century.
are middle of the century. By the end of the century,
I can give you my private suspicion, is they thought they didn't need it.
yeah.
My bassinet, if I forget the cord that holds it on, it doesn't fall off. My nail stays on no matter what I do. And a slashing weapon through it probably wouldn't render the nail useless in a permanent way. It might mess it up a little bit. You can always fix it after the battle if you survive. And it goes back to that idea that you're only fighting one battle right now, and there's probably some amount of lag time before you have to go to war again. Even if you're on the tournament circuit, you know, a later day William Marshall who's riding around from tournament to tournament to tournament, you still have time. And if you're winning in those tournaments, you have money to pay armors to fix your stuff before you have to go back and use it again.
Do you know if those were riveted on the other side, or?
Yeah, they are riveted.
Aren't they, and it's like two rivets?
Yeah, keep them in place. It's not a single rivet, there's a pair of rivets. And I can't tell you what's on the full tip. It's only examples because I haven't seen the inside of those colors. Any other questions? Yeah.
Question on the wedges, you just talked about, would those have been welded on, or is that?
No, they're riveted. A couple
Oh,
of
that's
pegs,
what
a
you're
couple of
saying.
pegs on the inside. Yeah, on this example, it's approximately here and here. There are little shafts that go through, and they're simply pinned over on the inside.
What was pretty common for the hinges for lifting up the visor? Was it to the side or was it flip up?
In terms of how the visor lifts,
Right.
a lot of these examples are center hinge, flat visor mounted. That is to say, they hang from a central hinge like this. But there's also a lot of them that have the side pivots. This, although it's generally associated with Germany, is found all over Europe for a while. But the side pivot replaces it. They're concurrent for the second and third quarters of the 14th century. But eventually the side pivot replaces it in popularity. This remains a much more popular style in Germany long after everybody else has gone to the side pivots.
He's got a picture of that fascinating unique.
Really?
Because I was assumed that so you really can get a feeling for just how pointy that visor is. It looks like it's strictly one. It is. It's a little bit.
I don't have to see that. But this visor, by the way, has a mate. It has a virtual twin in Italy. It's almost identical. Clearly, same workshop produced them. The other one has an armorer's mark. This one doesn't. All right. Questions?
Perhaps since it didn't have an armorer's mark,
I'm sorry?
perhaps because the other one didn't have an armorer's mark, it's an export harness?
It could be. A lot of 14th century armor is unmarked. I would say, in fact, most 14th century armor is unmarked. There's probably 20–30% of the surviving examples have armorer's marks, but most of them don't. Some of the things that appear to be armorer's marks are actual personal owner or arsenal marks that were put on during the working life of these, even after the 14th century, in the 15th, 16th, 17th century, as some of this armor continued to be used in arsenals. All right. Lost my train of thought. Okay. Yeah, we're gonna. All right, triangular lugs, that's where we are. All right, since there's about 200 bassinets that survive, only 3 of them have these triangular lugs. It's hard to know how common they were. And they do disappear by about 1370, you don't see them anymore. Other bassinets have holes that indicate that they may once have held those lugs. But those are always single holes. So it's less convincing that they may have once held those lugs.
You say that you don't see a measure up there, you said when you first start seeing them.
There's only 3 examples.
So,
Of the surviving ones. In the effigies, you'll see them in 1350.
okay.
So, I mean, they're pretty short-lived ones. Do you have an example there?
Yes, I do.
I know the Freiburg Cathedral one has them, but you may not know them. While you're looking on breastplates. Breastplates show the greatest variety of innovations on skidding weapons. 3 different types of defenses are known on breastplates. The most common of these is the V-shaped stop rib or lizard and leg. Middle of the upper half of the breastplate And it's got a, usually held with 3 rivets, sometimes, as in the case of the Cherbourg breastplate, has 5 rivets holding it in place. There are 6 known surviving 14th century breastplates. Of these 6 surviving breastplates, 5 were originally fitted with this V-shaped stop rim. The 6th example, which is S33 in Castle Cherbourg, was substantially reworked in the 15th century, and it's hard to tell if the holes for it were simply filled up. There are no longer any holes for it. So it could be that all 6 of the surviving ones were originally fitted with these. Parts were removed and holes were filled on that example, and it was massively changed. Nevertheless, there does not ever appear to have been a stop rim attached to it. The Liseré Durette, or stop rim, was probably primarily designed to divert an oncoming lance point. Because of the globose shape of 14th century breastplates, any thrusting blow, such as delivered by a lance, delivered at the midpoint of the breastplate, would tend to glance upward and towards the neck, right? In the 14th century, we don't have gorgets, so mail is the primary thing protecting it. We don't want that. That's a bad idea. So if you take something and you head it up here, you want to make it not go at the neck, but rather go up over the shoulders. And if you can get it to go over the shoulders, your chances of survival are much higher. At the very worst, it's going to catch you in the shoulder rather than the throat. The throat's usually fatal. Shoulder is painful, debilitating, but it's survivable. When the skimming point came in contact with the stop rim, it would have deflected from the neck, away from the neck, and over the shoulders. Breastplates also employed a second form of defense against skidding weapons. An integral defense was created by making the edges of the breastplate flange outward. If you look at this one, if it hits here and it's heading upward, it's going right over the shoulder. But what happens if it hits above this? It's still going to go upward, and you have a very widely turned neck flange. The neck is the most important thing to keep it away from. You don't want your throat. It's bad if it hits you in the armpit, but it's really bad if it hits you in the throat. That example is another reworked breastplate, late 14th century breastplate, adapted for use in the 15th century, 1415, 1420, as a lower portion added. But that flange is the biggest on any of the surviving vehicles.
Doug, why do you think they had both the stop rim and the next one?
In case it hits above it. Above that way.
So,
Why don't they just make one?
yeah.
This one, if you put it too high, it's not going to do what it needs to do. So if you move it up here, it's more likely to send it where you don't need to go. Well, this is kind of an awkward one. It's really designed to send it to the armpit. But if you hit it here, you really don't want it to catch you here, because it's not going to be as good at deflecting because it's not as angular.
Okay.
This is the primary defense. It's very angular. It's made to do it. This is sort of a fail-safe. It's a second parachute, if you will, just in case the first one doesn't open. Right. Parishes is one of the few examples that doesn't really do much. It does have flange.
It has
Rolled edges, and actually a fairly strong return with the detonators.
Doug, I'm passing around Cherbourg right now.
Okay, good. This one's in the Gwynn collection. Was in the Gwynn collection, we sold off, and its current whereabouts are less well known. Both the neck and the arm openings employ this technique. It's got widely turned flanges, not just at the neck, but also at the arms. It doesn't appear on most of the other examples using big rolled edges. On occasions, these flared arm and neck openings were used in conjunction with the Liseré Durette, as an example in the Gwynn collection. Some examples of covered cuirasses, often called corazinas, were using additional forms of defense. This example was found at the arsenal, which was walled up to protect it from the Turks at Chalcis, and it opens down the front in the manner of a waistcoat. You open it like this to put it on. You can't put a V-shaped stock rib on that. So, when we look at some of the other examples, which are clearer because the velvet covering is gone from the same source in Calcas, you can find there are defenses designed to do the same thing. Of the 16 known breastplate portions or halves from Calcas, 3 of them are fitted with stock ribs riveted around the arm openings, and 2 of them also have stock ribs following the neck openings. You see here, large plate right here, 3 rivets securing it, designed to take that skinny weapon and keep it away from the armpit. Once again, if you deflect it here and there, you're better off. And the same thing here. These 2 in conjunction are an attempt to channel where the weapon is going to go. These would have controlled the skinny weapons in the same way as a strongly turned neck or arm opening, guiding the skinny weapon over the shoulder. The reason it's not turned is because the fabric has to cover all the surfaces. If you have this big flange, you can't cover it neatly, so it's an applied part. This would have been on top of the velvet covering. Okay? And there's traces of the velvet underneath these. Question?
So the cuirass itself will be covered, but the stoppers will be riveted on over the cover.
Exactly right. They're bright steel at the time, maybe gilded, although there's no evidence of that. The idea is they'd be shiny metal on top of a cloth surface showing only the studs of the heads of the rivets. In the case of the Calcas ones, they're typically gilt rivet heads showing through. So it would have been kind of a fancy look. At the same time, possibly cheaper to produce than solid steel breastplates, smaller pieces. It's an alternative at the very least. Some of the examples, by the way, of Calcas do not have these. When they do, this part does flange forward slightly to kind of do that in a less effective manner.
Those are early 15th century.
Yeah, that's debatable as to their date. Early as 1375 is a lot of the current information says that maybe as early as 1375. Certainly not later than 1425. We've got a 50-year window in which they are here as a popular form of defense. You can find artistic representations of their early, and it's hard to guess the date on them. A lot of the Calcas armor predates the 14th century, predates the 15th century. Because they opened down the front, you can't use the stock rim. They had to come up with other ideas. The upper edges of cuisses were also occasionally fitted with stock ribs as well. There's one surviving example of this film. This is preserved in the Royal Armouries in the Lone Collection. When considering this stock rib, it may at first seem an unlikely place for a defense of this sort. However, when one considers that a knight was a mounted warrior, and that when one is seated on a horse, a glancing blow riding along the cuisse would tend to head for the groin, it gives a certain reason to put this in there. This applied stock rib would have certainly provided some much welcomed additional groin protection. There's no known cups that survive from the Middle Ages, and you're not having the full armored pants of Henry VIII, so it's a fairly lightly defended area. This stock rib in particular is interesting in that it changes in shape. It's very wide here, and it gets taller as it comes down here, and then it flanges upward into a little rosette-headed ribbon to attach it. It's really interesting shape, and lots of chisel marks along it to give it some stuff. It's the only surviving example that we have.
Such an excellent piece.
It really is.
No photographs.
No.
It does not show up any really good shot.
Put it on numbers. Just looking at this, by the way, the way it was riveted on, probably not a construction technique, probably repair. It broke off. Anybody who's fought in their armor for a long time, no stress cracks develop right around those corners, and it could easily just break off. It could be a construction technique. It could have been a later addition. It's hard to know, but it's probably not original to, or at least a repair.
Doug, you found an effigy, a German effigy with that same weird lane.
Oh, really? Because that's also bizarre.
Yeah.
You don't typically see that. In the 14th century, often this lane, we'll see that in the next slide, the crease is the upper lane. It's all integral. And there we are. You can see that there's no upper lane. It's actually, it bulges out like that to form that. More commonly, stop ribs seem to have been incorporated into the roll at the upper edge. Look at the size of that roll. I mean, it's a nice big honking roll. And we've done the same thing as a stop rib. Some subtle details to notice while we're looking at this. No planar surfaces. It comes up, it sweeps, it comes in. Even this sweeps down and out, slightly flanged. Nothing is simply two-dimensional. By making this roll large, the armor could create a more cohesive looking armor and avoid the necessity of attaching a separate piece of metal. Yeah.
That last slide, does that edge on the, when it's going this way, does it flange out like this?
Show me where it's
Go on the rolled edge up there, like it's coming towards you. Does that hold?
It comes out and around. It's a big, fat, outwardly rolled edge.
No,
But it's consistent diameter.
not just the rolled edge, but that entire edge towards the kneecap.
This edge is straight and flat. Well, I mean, it's not straight, it's actually shaped.
Because the top view up there looks like it might be rolled out.
No, it's not. That's, I think, just a trick of the light. You can see, by the way, some of the details for the leather tab that probably would have been used to support it, to lace it to the jerkin, the undergarments. Integral stop ribs become a prominent feature of 15th and 16th century leg harnesses. This is obviously not a 14th century leg harness. But when you look at it, you can see where this technique goes. You take away that stop rib, you make a rolled edge. Here, in this particular leg harness, you have this gigantic triangular roll that takes that and incorporates it into the design, into the art of the piece. Similar defenses are found on van braces, and similar defenses to those found on breastplates can be found on van braces of most arm harnesses. The upper edge of the van brace cap is typically turned outward to form a barrier against weapons skidding from the more lightly armored inside of the elbow. You can see the nice big fat rolled edge here, where you don't have that big fat rolled edge anywhere else. There's a reason it appears in this place and not anywhere else. Remember, your arms are away from you, things are attacking, coming towards you. You don't want them to go into the more vulnerable insides of the arms. Like breastplates, van braces were occasionally fitted. Where did my picture go? I think I may have lost power. I have to fix that. So I'm going to go here. Bear with me for a second. I'm going to lose my slideshow. All right, we got it back? Okay. Like breastplates, van braces were occasionally fitted with applied stop ribs. These examples are in the Metropolitan Museum. They also came from Calcas. I'm afraid I don't have photographs of them that are of any quality, so we have to make do with mine. There are only 5 surviving van braces with applied stop ribs. 4 of these examples once belonged to Bachelor Dean and are now preserved in the Metropolitan Museum in New York. All 4 of those van braces, along with 4 others that came from the same source, which is the arsenal of Calcas. 2 of the 4 are equipped with stop ribs on the inside cap plate, and all 4 of them have them on the outside cap plate. This one serves the same function as this roll. This one is just plain weird, right? There's nothing vulnerable. And strangely enough, it's this one that survives into the 15th century.
What about sliding up under the lane at the elbow?
They didn't seem to be concerned with things getting into lanes anywhere else.
Just a thought.
Yeah,
It's about the only thing I can think of.
and when we get into the 15th century, they appear in another weird place too. But we'll get there. Most of them also have these really strongly turned, rolled edges at the elbows, even if they have that applied style. There are two other examples from beyond those from Calcas, which have applied stock ribs. These also have them on the outsides of the band braces, not on the insides. Yeah, Tom.
It appears that these stop ribs, they don't like be like on the breastplate.
No, they're very flat.
So doesn't that actually give somewhere for the lance to catch?
Yeah.
So
These are among the more,
they're not, okay.
and it's an oddity that appears not just in one case. So it must have had a function. But what the function is, I'm afraid I don't have a complete answer.
On the other hand, if you consider
Yes.
foot combat and the blow coming down the arm, you want to stop it before it
Possibly.
comes into the side of the body.
But then
Those are also not.
Yes, but you can
They're floating
decelerate it with your own.
And it doesn't actually
The
wound
Calcas
you.
ones are all.
Yeah.
It doesn't wound you.
In the 15th century.
Skip.
Yes, but it's,
Skip.
yeah.
It is at least a thought for that particular pair.
more like lancing, where if you want
And that's
horseback, you got clock.
Oh, yeah.
let's see. Which other examples?
Armors.
Body joints such as the armpit, neck, crotch, and inner elbow were commonly not armored with plate defenses well into the next century. Interestingly, a stop rib applied to the outside of the arm, just below the elbow, would seem to be counterproductive. Must have served a function other than turning weapons away from body joints. Unfortunately, I simply don't know what that is. These stop ribs and flared edges are important, though rarely considered features of many 14th century pieces of armor. While the application of stop ribs begins to die out in the 15th century, and integral defenses, as we saw in that late 15th, early 16th century, paired legs, become more common, applied ribs did not disappear altogether. In 1450, applied stop ribs were still common in two places on Milanese armors. The V-shaped stop rib is replaced with this unusual, I don't even know how to describe that shape, stop rib. Horn shaped, strange, but they're still there. And the idea that this one would no longer function in the way that it would on others. It also still appears on the outside of 15th century arms. And occasionally, up here, you can't see it in this example because it's covered, there's another stop rib there. It's possible in the 15th century, they were simply fashionable because they ceased to serve the function they did in the 14th century. It's also possible they served another enigmatic function that we cannot currently figure out. Whatever its function, it remained a necessity for much of the next century. By examining the form of armor, we can learn a great deal about its intended function. And when we examine the innovations which appeared in the later half of the 14th century, which is usually referred to as the transitional period, from mail to plate, an age of innovation and change. We can get a glimpse into the thought process of the armorer as he struggled with the advantages that the glancing surface provided for the armored knight and the problems that it created. Questions?
Is it possible in that previous image, go back to it, is it at all possible that the lower limbs towards the wrist on the elbow cup are inset in the band brace rather than attached to the out?
Trying this one?
Yeah.
No, it's secured by 3 rivets, and these rivets are also passing through slots to provide lateral movement. That's very typical of 14th century Italian armor, and this is a 15th century Italian armor.
Okay.
Definitely laid on top of it and articulates not in this direction, but lateral.
How would those bridges look like?
With rivets. In this case, you can't see it because it's covered up, but you can see the rivet here, and at the ends. And in the case of some of the ones from Calcus, some of them have an integral little nub in the middle that passes through the metal to give it some stability. It's kind of like a staple going into the metal. It's integral.
Were those slots more commonly on the van brace or the line?
Slots?
For the,
You mean the slots are always
yeah,
on?
the van
They
brace?
appear on the van brace. And the lane has 3 rivets, almost always 3 rivets, even in the rivets. And the slots are pretty sizable. They provide this kind of.
Quick perspective on motion.
Yeah. And it's
That would
really
make
cool.
sense. I was just curious if there were any other
There's
examples.
no other evidence.
Just-
And that's why in all 14th century arms, even in the 15th century, 1 lane up, 2 lanes down. This lane is not articulating. This lane is an extension essentially of this van brace. Its articulation, its motion side to side.
Unless they use it to keep away from that particular.
A vulnerable joint. And when you look at the ones at Sherburne, they have those slots. You can clearly see them. All 3 of those examples have that. So that's, I guess, another factor.
Here's a thought. Since those slots have to maintain a very parallel nature, but that is actually not a stopper, it's a stiffener, so that a blow coming in and striking outside the van brace doesn't expand it and prevent you from then.
It doesn't explain this one.
It's leather.
It's fashion.
Following the fashion.
Well,
Or it keeps it.
So they could be 2 things serving different functions that happen to look the same. Yeah, all good
Maybe rid
ideas.
of the 3 spots though.
That one, and this one might be just both mimicking the steel one and
Yeah, but I
keeping
mean,
it
it
short.
shows, see there, it's stiff. Well, when you're considering that these are maybe 21 gauge, 22 gauge, there's got a whole elbow. That's all really substantial and it was very thin. You can kind of take a look at some of the reels that are over here. They're analogous.
Yeah, they're really big.
Could it be that this piece was made by a mediocre armorer who was trying to mimic something else who didn't have a full understanding?
It's not kind of beauty.
That's why
It's a little more munitions grade than these lovely,
They were just trying-
Italian,
trying to mimic it
shaped,
without
nice.
understanding the function.
And this is a German example.
That ties back into your earlier things that a lot of munitions teas, there was not just bad.
Form follows function.
one of those too.
There's
Look
gotta
like
be a-
that. Exactly.
We start with this as the earliest one in the slideshow. It is 1240. It's the long speed effigy. And what you can see is a guy head to toe in mail. The only suggestion in this particular effigy of anything rigid is his head defense. Some sort of a skull cap under his mail.
Or maybe pads.
Maybe just padded, right.
Or-
But there's certainly, he's not covered in plate. Yeah.
Isn't he wearing some kind of hard knee stuff?
There's none of this effigy. You can see the little bands there.
Yeah.
But these are essentially garters.
Oh,
There's not yet any evidence of anything neat on this effigy. Another picture of the same effigy, just a different drawings. At this point, 1250. Once again, you see the same thing, head to toe male, shape of head.
It's
No real
okay,
difference.
Vance. It's okay.
Again, 1260, but you see something. Look at his knee. He's got a little tiny disc applied to his knee, and this is actually been damaged. It's not. It doesn't have anything there. But he's got a little tiny plate attached to his knee. First effigy that I've found that has plate on it. I'm sure there are more, and this is a project that's in the works. Going on, 1277, the John Algernon, the elder, the earlier one, has pretty fully developed knee armor. Maybe brass, Latin, could be leather, could be steel, could be applique stuff, could be paint. But he definitely has fully developed knee protection, and a really bulbous helmet. Now, when you look at the Robert Duke of Normandy, 1280, he's back to full mail. So just because somebody came up with it, at least the artist at this point didn't feel he needed to carve it. Although there's a possibility of a retro look, since Robert Duke of Normandy is dead for 300 years at the point his effigy was carved. Then we get to the Roger Trumpington effigy at 1289. He's got nicely developed knees, and he's got a great helmet, sugarloaf helmet, attached with a guard chain, which you can see. And if a person has a guard chain, it'll either be attached to the belt or oftentimes to a solid cuirass. And oftentimes when you see guard chains on effigies in art, authors argue that that is evidence for a solid person. Whether or not that's accurate is certainly one of the typical arguments. Or something rigid, though, not mail. 1290, we're back to mail from head to toe, but he's got a really weird looking lower lip. Possibly some sort of protection under his mail. We're seeing that come through. It's also possible the artist who drew this rendition didn't know what he was doing. This is a Hewitt drawing. This drawing is pretty accurate.
Those are after stock.
Right. 1300, you've got a visible helmet, but nothing else. It's back to mail. 1300, knees and a full-length arm surcoat, so you can't tell if he's got anything in his arms.
Those like straps on his elbows?
On his wrists.
On his wrist?
Tighten that nail down, or secure a mitten. He's wearing these mitten mufflers. This guy's one of my favorites. 1300 in Ash Church, we don't know who it is. But nice knees. But look at the crease that runs down his leg. There's clearly something under there. And that's, although this is another Hewitt drawing, that's the way this one looks. Very definitely a crease. So there's greaves under here. And that's pretty good information. Still's got that big melon too.
Which is so bizarre, under the mail.
It does make a lot of sense.
It's weird when they do it in USAA.
And anybody who's ever bought a mail under, a mail over plate armor of any form finds the mail gets smashed. Right, puts it in.
What's going on with the shoulder?
Oh yes.
Huh?
Little heraldic things to display his arms. Probably don't have an armor function. Though,
Other than,
around the turn of the century,
I'm me,
something
don't hit me.
yeah, I'm a good guy. See, you can see there's a lot of it. They could be made of parchment. For a long time, people thought they were like an early form of the
Unit
Korean Guard.
insignia.
But it doesn't seem to be any evidence.
What's around his head? Is that a traveling pillow for the flight to the Holy Land? Or?
Exactly. Yeah. Want to make sure he's comfortable. That's a pillow. That's exactly what it is. His head's resting on a pillow. And you see that on a few of the others. I don't see it. This guy's resting on his helmet. All right, 1325. Unfortunately, I have a little gap here of 25 years. I really want to fill this in because we make a huge gap from the beginning of the 14th century to here. But here we go. Look at this guy. He's got a bassinet type thing. He's got arms with lovely lion's face spalders, lion's face rondelles on the elbow. He has a vambrace with inset hinges, so it's nicely cased. Legs, he's got knees. He's got greaves, they're splinted, and they're three-quarter greaves, there's more on the outside. He's got sabatons and clear evidence of coated plates over the neck.
Isn't this degree?
Yeah, yeah, you should be able to find it in the upper corner if people have followed me.
When did he die versus when was this effigy done?
And there's always a question when you look at effigies. Most of them are done fairly close to death. But especially when you get into the later 14th century and you go into monumental brasses, there's a certain style in England that is very cookie cutter, and you bought them off a rack. Didn't necessarily represent who you were.
Are there any other views of this? Like, do we know if it's a center point or if it's more of a...
This is like a brass, it's not a three-dimensional object. right, 1330, same kind of deal. Big honking rondelles, come to nice spiky points, elbow cop rondelle. This guy only has a band brace only here, not here. My experience of fighting says I get hit here, or then I get hit here, and it hurts more when I get hit here. But maybe it's under there.
Yeah, that may be,
Maybe we fight
that may be artistic also.
Yeah, but it appears over and over again.
All right, think about it, Doug. All right, if you have it on the outside of the hand, now the artist has put in a prayer mode, and it would look like it would.
It could be. Yeah, it could have just rolled out.
Because it's here, and you rotate with the arm, maybe.
And I would also freely admit that what I do with a sword is not what my ancestors did.
Yeah, our perspective is skewed.
So, I mean, just because I get these deep bone bruises here, and it doesn't mean they didn't. Yeah.
Do you think those are, like embossed pork-belly knees?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, look at all the floral decoration. Yeah, I think that's embossed. Totally. I think it's got applied brass. The whole of the rest of everything has these scalloped and railed borders. My vision for that is, aside from the knees, it's steel with brass borders. But it could be leather with brass borders. It could be brass with steel borders. It could be anything. We don't know. But it wouldn't be a major leap of faith to say that's leather and brass and steel all together.
What about aluminum and titanium borders?
I'm pretty sure aluminum with titanium borders. In fact, that's what I was going to say.
That's good, Calvin.
1331. Once again, 1331, we could be back almost 100 years. You know, think about 1270, 50 years. You know, he's got these. He's got nothing else. Is he going for a retro look? Was the artistic representation trying to make him look like a cousin, an uncle, his father's brains? Wanted to make them match, and it's a generation earlier style? Or is this evidence that in 1331 people were dressing the same way they dressed in 1275?
It could have been a sign of status, too, not as wealthy as some of the others.
Although this buckle with the two ears is the height of fashion in 1331. It is a 1331 quintessential buckle.
So maybe
Maybe just his belt is fashion.
they just wanted him to look like they did back in the day.
It could be. And I think that's not a bad idea. Or it could also be, he's a little backwards.
Grandpa's good enough.
Could have been like those SCA fighters that prefer to have more freedom of movement.
Yeah, from an artist standpoint, it could be that he did that for detail because it would have blended right into his coat. Somewhat like the shield, could have saw that not that much detail artistic.
Anything is possible. We're talking about artists.
Yeah, or made sufficiently before his death.
That's true. I mean, he could have had this made in 1300 and he didn't die until 1330. This is all right. It's another possibility. This one's a French one, although there's an English so far. But you can see in France, 1331, the last effigy's not that far out of whack with. Rondelles clearly laced to the nail. You can see the little lace points. It's got a little skull